Alrighty, looks like we are live. Welcome everyone to another Properties and Beers. Today is the Hurry Up and Wait edition, and you're like, Goro, what the hell is Hurry Up and Wait? And I promise I'll get to it. So, the investors who get hurt over the next few years won't just be the ones who buy the wrong property. A lot of them will be the ones who wait too long to get their strategy sorted. Because you know what? Property still rewards patience, and that's a wait part of the Hurry Up and Wait. A good investment doesn't need to impress you in the first 6 months. It needs to make sense over the next 10 years. But there are moments where the finance window, lending window, or even the policy window changes quickly. And when that happens, waiting can cost you options. And that's the hurry up part. So tonight, let's talk about that. Hurry up and wait. All right. So we'll talk about long-term investing. We'll talk about SMSF borrowing deadline coming up on the 10th of August, and also want to talk to you about cash flow positive property and how it's becoming harder and harder to ignore, and explain why we launched the Yield Club, which we did this week, because I don't want people thinking this is just a fancy name for a property list. It isn't. It was built because investors were frustrated. They're talking to a lot of people, and they're getting sent random properties. They're getting told that every suburb is the next damn hotspot. They're hearing one thing from another person, one thing from another friend, and somewhere in the middle, they're trying to make sense of the biggest financial decisions of their life. And that's a tough place to be. So if you're watching tonight and you've been thinking, I want to invest, but I don't know what actually suits me anymore, this one could be useful. So if you're sitting there with the money in super and you've been considering an SMSF property, a self-managed super property strategy, this one becomes especially important, because if you already own property and wonder whether growth alone is enough in the market, I want you to listen closely. My name is Gaurav Gupta, CEO and founder of Ethical Property Investments. We help everyday Aussies just like you and me invest in high cash flow properties that both do good and make money. And by that, I mean properties that are built around real housing needs, strong rental income, and a strategy that actually fits the person buying it. Because that last part is where a lot of people get caught. The property might look good on paper, and on the brochure, it might look damn good. The yield might look fantastic, but if the strategy is wrong, the timing's wrong, and the lending doesn't stack up, or the cash flow doesn't support the household, that can turn to stress very quickly. So let's get on to it properly. Now, before we get started, properties and beers, got to get on the beers. Today we've got Hans Super Dry, low carb, 1.1 gram of carbs. That's right. Can you believe there's a 1 gram carb beer with only 50 calories? That's fantastic. By the way, that's about half the amount of calories as a vodka, from what I know, or a half amount of calories as a champagne, right? So, guys, I'm going to put it into my Do Good Make Money, and we'll keep at it. So, those that are watching, welcome. If you want to see my beverage again, let me know. But it's actually quite nice. Would do with a bit more chili, and unfortunately, it's only 0.5% standard drink, so got to work on that one. So, the first thing I want to say is that property rewards patience. For finance windows, they can close quickly, and they are about to close for a certain group of individuals. And that's where a lot of investors, they're getting really confused, because I hear people say property is a long-term game, and they take that to mean there's never any urgency. That's not always true. The true cost is waiting. The property itself might be a 10-year decision, but the strategy around the property, that for some people is about to change in a matter of weeks. The lending rules can change. The bank's appetite can change. And you see policy settings, they can and they have changed. And right now, SMSF residential borrowing is a very real example of that. Before we get to the SMSF deadline, I want to talk on a bigger point first, right? One of the biggest mistakes people make in property is expecting every deal to pay off immediately. They then buy something after 3 months, and they're checking, they buy something, and then after 3 months, they're checking realestate.com.au every second day going, oh, my mate who told me in this barbecue to buy in Perth, grew 10%. Why hasn't my property in X amount of other location moved in the last 3 months? Because it's not damn supposed to. That's a very short lens for an asset that's supposed to serve you for years. Smart investors, the ones that have been investing for 20, 30 plus years, they look at property through a 5 to 10 year lens. So if a property's done absolutely nothing for 5 years, fair enough. You probably should review it. You look at the market, look at the rent, look at the demand, look at if the fundamentals make sense. You look at whether the original reason for buying still holds up. But if you're looking at property through a 6-month or 1-year lens, expecting to buy, sell, and make the kind of growth that some people have made in certain markets over the last few years, you're probably going to be disappointed. That's not the way I'd be approaching property, especially in the current market, right? There's an easy growth cycle that's rewarded so many people. From here, the smarter investors actually been asking a better quality question. You want to know what those questions are? A, can this property make sense over the next 5 to 10 years? Can I hold it comfortably? Is there real demand behind it? And can the income support the strategy? That's a lens. Those are the 4 questions I want people using, right? Sorry, this is properties and beers, right? You see, good investment doesn't always give you fireworks straight away. Sometimes it gives you boring consistency. And sometimes it gives you income. And that's a good thing. As a matter of fact, sometimes it gives you the ability to hold through the flat years without being forced to sell. And then when the market turns, you're still there. That's where wealth is built. Now, we've seen this with regional Western Australia, right? There are periods where certain regional Western Australian markets can move so quickly and they see strong rental demand, tight vacancy, resource activity, and suddenly values can jump. And the quick wins, that's what people love to talk about, right? But then there are some markets that have flat periods and they can sit there and do very little for a while. I'll give you an example. I had clients who we put into Brisbane, and Brisbane missed a growth spurt that it should have had. And they were coming to me going, Goro, you sold us in the wrong place, etc., etc. I'm like, no, the fundamentals make sense. You shouldn't be able to buy a townhouse for $300K about 15 kilometers from the city, right? That's not normal. So that's underpriced. We should be seeing growth. It's like, oh, it hasn't grown. Guess what happened when they finally sold it? Literally 2 months later, the growth spurt started, and that property that was purchased for $330 is worth over $800,000 now. That's one of the biggest lessons for Aussies in the property market right now. The market's become more fragmented. And you know what? I was listening to a podcast with the head of Cotality and Mark Boris last night. And here's what they said about it. Tim Lawless, by the way. Tim Lawless and Mark Boris are on the podcast. And here's what they said about it. You can't just look at a national headline and assume that it tells you what's happening on the ground. One city's going to be slowing down. Another region might be tightening. Another some might have too much supply, right? Just take, for example, I'll use Melbourne example. Everyone said Melbourne's, been sitting flat, doing not very much. Do you know Frankston grew about 20% in the last year? Right? And another suburb about 20 minutes down the road might have strong rental demand, low vacancy, but hasn't really done much, right? And this is the kind of thing that you need to really look for, right? And that's why broad headlines can be super dangerous for investors. They make you think when there might be no opportunities left, when really the opportunities just move somewhere more specific. And it might have missed the growth spurt for various different reasons, right? But the thing is, it catches up over time. And that's also why we don't chase a headline yield. A big yield on its own doesn't tell you enough. You need to look at what's sitting underneath it. You need to look at vacancy rates, population growth, migration, employment, infrastructure, changing workforce trends. Those are things that tell you whether income's really got a strong foundation behind it. Because, look, the goal isn't to buy the hottest looking deal at the moment. You see, the goal is actually to buy an asset supported by real demand. So it's got a better chance of delivering sustainable cash flow and long-term capital growth. I'll cover more about this in a moment. But if you've got any questions, guys, I'm watching the chat right there on the screen. Drop a line. We are, sorry. We are live. As you can tell, I'm dropping my tech. I'm wearing the cash flow shirt just for a bit of fun. So let's keep at it. Look. Oh, sorry, my tech's going on the fritz. So look, the goal isn't to buy the hottest looking deal at the moment. You see, the goal is to buy an asset supported by a real demand. So it's a better chance of delivering sustainable cash flow and the potential for long-term capital growth if that's where you're at. So, and that's why you can't judge every property through a 6-month emotional window. You need to understand why you bought it, right? Was it income? Was it growth? Was it a combination of both? Was it a market cycle play? Was it a cash flow positive hold? Is it inside SMSF? Was it supposed to support market sentiment? Because that answer, it changes the way you judge the property. Now, here's the important part, right? Long-term thinking doesn't mean that slow decision making on everything. If you're thinking about buying residential property through self-managed super fund using borrowing, that window has changed because the government's chosen, despite all the stupidity, to, sorry, can I tell you how I really feel about this opinion? To stop self-managed super funds from taking out new limited recourse borrowing arrangements against residential property, right? So in the future, you'll have commercial property. So if you're considering commercial property in super, that's cool. You can take your time. You don't have to rush. But if you're considering residential, in plain English, if you want to use lending in it to buy an SMSF property, that door's closing. The key date is 10th of August, which really means you have 1 to 2 weeks to really pick a property and get your act together. So if you haven't already applied for the loan, you better do that yesterday. If you want to know what kind of property is suitable, let me know, right? Now, if you've already got arrangements in place, that's cool. It's going to be grandfathered. If your SMSF's got enough cash to buy a property, that's also cool. That's different. But if you've got residential property in super, if you're looking to buy residential property in super, where you're relying on borrowing to help you scale, this one needs attention right now. And I want to be careful with how I say that. This is not a reason to go run out and buy the first damn property you see. I mean, that's how people make poor decisions, right? Luckily, property is a relatively forgiving asset, but it's a reason to get your strategy reviewed quickly. It's a reason to speak to your accountant, your SMSF specialist, your broker, and your property strategist right now, because the problem with SMSF property is that it's not something that'll sort out overnight. There's like so many things. There's a fund structure, there's a bare trust, there's a lending assessment, there's a contribution position, there's a deposit, there's a compliance side. Then there's a property itself. There's so many things to do. And honestly, if you don't have a mentor or strategist to guide you through it, it can be a bit like, I look at it later and just not have enough time. And that's a distinction I want people to understand today. Be patient with your wealth building journey. Be careful with your asset. Be sensible with your numbers. But when the strategy has a deadline, don't sleep on it. Because once a lending window closes, the conversation changes completely. And that leads us into the second part. Because whether you're investing personally or through a company or through a trust or through an SMSF, the same question keeps coming back. Can the property support you, or do you constantly need to support it? Right? Cash flow is becoming harder to ignore. I've always had the saying is that cash flow is king. And yes, I've got this shirt for it, right? Another great takeaway from that recent podcast, the one that was released yesterday with Mark Boris and Tim Lawless, was an emphasis on cash flow. They drop a line that really hit home, right? Mostly because it's exactly what we've been doing for such a long time now. Yield will be the play in the future. Cash flow is king, right? And I know some people don't like hearing that because for such a long time in Australia, the default property conversation has been really simple, right? Buy something, take a loss, claim what you can, wait for growth. And for most people in most markets during those time periods, that worked really well. I'm not here to pretend it never did. Hey, I made money that way. But the environment today has changed. And you know what? Mark Boris and Tim Lawless point out that we can't simply expect the conditions that drove up house price over the last 5 years to continue, especially with the recent government policy shifts. It aligns perfectly with what I've been saying for the longest time. The massive growth curves we've seen in states like Western Australia, South Australia, and Queensland are completely unsustainable. Normal, healthy growth, according to Tim Lawless from Happy Data Totality, is 4 to 6% per annum. So if you're looking for a damn unicorn that makes 10% per annum, I'll use a line that I heard in a movie, tell them they're dreaming, right? You might get lucky, but that's freaking luck. Luck is not how we should be playing this game. And is it, when that explosive capital growth yield eventually flattens out, the future returns will have to be driven by the yield curve catching up. Melbourne is a really good example of this. Mark and Tim spoke about Melbourne being one of the most interesting investment markets right now because it's sitting at a very different point in the cycle compared to, say, Sydney. there's now a record 55% price gap between Melbourne and Sydney, and Melbourne house values have grown around 1% on average for the last 5 years. So Sydney's still seeing some of the fastest population growth in the country, yes, driven largely by overseas migration. That's why some of the properties we have are suitable for that. That demand, it's showing up in the rental market too. The vacancy rates still sitting less than 2%, right? So now I need to keep having my beer. So when you look at, some areas that are inner city like Carlton, or even in regional hubs like Geelong and Ballarat, the conversation starts becoming really interesting. Your markets that have been held back on price, but have got a strong demand underneath. And that's where investors need to look beyond the headline, right? And so giving away a little bit of a secret about where some of my clients are looking, because a market that looks flat from the outside may still have the ingredients for a stronger yield, better rental demand, and long-term capital growth once the values start moving back towards equilibrium, because currently Melbourne is well below equilibrium. Now, I do have to say interest rates are higher than they were a few years ago. Insurance has gone up. Construction costs have shifted. Household budgets, they're tighter. And banks are looking closely at servicing what people can afford, and rightfully so, right? And so the question you should be asking is, how much longer can I afford to tipping money into my portfolio every month? And that's where cash flow positive property becomes a serious conversation. Because if your property is generating positive cash flow, pressure feels kind of different. You're not sitting there each month going, I hope my salary covers the gap. You're relying entirely on future growth to justify today's pain. And you have income coming in. The income, that gives people breathing room. Now let's talk about negative gearing for a moment. Look, I've got to say, I'm not against tax planning. Good tax advice has its place. But be very careful about building an entire property strategy around a government setting staying the same forever. We've seen this over the last 2 months. Governments change, budgets change, tax settings change. Lending rules will change. We're watching it happen right across the property and super landscape. So when someone says, my whole strategy works because of negative gearing, my question is, has been, it no longer is, because I've got a better question. My question has been, what happens if the rules shift? What happens if your income changes? What happens if the property stays flat for longer than expected? My question now is, what are you going to do next? Now, that's not fear. Rather, that's proper risk thinking. A stronger portfolio should be able to handle more than one version of the future. And that's why I keep coming back to cash flow. That's why I keep coming back to all-weather portfolios. A positive cash flow property gives you more options, helps you hold out longer, helps you service better. It might reduce the emotional pressure when the market goes flat. And it might give you the confidence to keep making sensible decisions instead of reaching out when it's stressful. That's where strategies like specialist disability accommodation, dual key, granny flats, they all come into the conversation, because not only are they different property types, they all come from different models. A standard residential property might have one tenant and one rent stream. And if that tenant leaves, that income can go to zero until it's leased again. Well, a well-designed co-living property can have multiple rooms, multiple income streams, and more resilience if one room becomes vacant. SCA can serve a very specific housing need, and it might generate much stronger rental income when it's designed, located, tenanted, and managed properly. Because here's the thing, dual key and granny flat strategies, they can also create more than one income from one lot. Now, none of these are magic. They all need proper due diligence. They need the right location. They need the right management, and they all need to suit the investor, which is you. So a cash flow property that's wrong for your situation, it's still going to create some problems. So I don't want anyone hearing this and thinking, right, I'm just going to go out and chase the biggest yield. That, my friends, is dangerous, because yield's only one part of the decision. You need to understand the borrowing. You need to understand the operating costs. You need to understand the demand, the management. You need to understand your very own risk position, because the goal is not to buy something that looks impressive on a spreadsheet, right? The goal is to own something that can perform in the real world. And that's where a lot of investors get stuck, right? They know they need the income. They know they know the old approach, it feels harder, right? They know they don't want to keep feeding property every single month. And they know the open, but then they open the market and they get overwhelmed, because you know what? Everyone's got a deal. Everyone's got a damn suburb. Everyone has a pitch, whether it's right or not. And the investor's left to work out, Which one of these actually suits me? And that's the exact frustration which led me to build the Yield Club. Look, the Yield Club exists because investors need strategy over property. And I was having this conversation with someone just today. He went to another agent. I won't mention his name, but let's just say he goes in under the guise of teaching people how to pay down their mortgages and has a property, sells them on the back end of it. I'm not going to mention his name for personal reasons because he might watch this. But he was saying, hey, they were just trying to sell me a property after doing 10 minutes of strategy. And he's like, no, that's not what I want. I want a deep dive on strategy. Now, I want to explain what Yield Club is, but what we do, part of what starts at the very first thing is that we do at least 8 hours of due diligence on your strategy before we even look at a property for you. And that's why I really want to explain this property, because I don't want people misunderstanding what it is, right? It's not a place where we can just throw a few properties in a database and say, here you go, pick one. That is a lazy approach, and that wouldn't be very helpful for investors, would it? And honestly, that's a part of the industry that I see that frustrates a lot of people. You speak to people, and before they really understand your situation, they're already showing you property. You don't know your lending position. You don't know your household budget. This might be your first property. That's not a safe place to DIY this, right? You don't know whether you're trying to build retirement income, replace personal income, reduce pressure, diversify your portfolio, or just invest through super, right? They just know they have something to sell you. And I've watched this happen in the industry for the longest time. Look, when we first started almost 15 years ago, our company was called 10 Properties in 10 Years. Back then, the idea of a marketing agent, which is what most people are, was still fairly new in the market, right? What I did was, let's do a marketing agency and let's bring in the ethics of how we actually built our portfolio. Now, over time, what started happening was that wholesale aggregators, they started setting up stock lists. Then you see these lazy marketers that take the same stock, put it on their own list, and send it out to investors without really thinking about whether property was a good long-term purchase, hoping the client would do all the due diligence. Well, that's not a proper strategy. There's no damn due diligence for that. There's no serious thought about whether the investor can hold it, whether the suburb was right, whether the rental demand was there, or whether property would still make sense 5 to 10 years from now. That, my friends, is the biggest reason Yield Club was created. Because we put a property on, before we put a property on our own books, we spend hours reviewing it properly, even before showing it to a client. And some properties passed, some properties fell, right? We had most of our properties that we put through our books on our Yield Club actually failed this week. And that's the point, because we recently looked at the property where the numbers look really strong, right? Estimated rental yield was 72 to 78K per annum, almost an 11% yield. Sounded great, right? Most people would think that. But when we dug deeper, it didn't pass our Yield Club checklist. Why? Because we found oversupply in that area. And the oversupply, by the way, was a rental vacancy of 15% plus. So when we looked at the headline yield, that looked strong, but the fundamentals underneath weren't strong enough for us to be comfortable to put it forward. And that's the difference. A property that didn't go into our Yield Club, that doesn't go into our Yield Club, a property that doesn't go into the Yield Club isn't because the numbers look exciting. It's got to pass the checklists that matter for the investor's long-term position. That's how we operate. With the Yield Club, a property's got to earn its place. Before an opportunity gets put in front of investors, there are hours of due diligence that we get to put behind it, right? We'll look at the location, the rental pathway, the demand, the build strategy, the management requirements, whether the numbers are realistic, and what type of investor it might suit. And just as importantly, what type of investor it might not suit. Like I was having a chat with someone earlier today. I said, hey, we won't put you into a property until we're right. And if it takes 6 months or 1 year to get you the right property, that's how long it takes us. Because sometimes the right advice is, this one's not for you. And that's absolutely fine. That might not be the most exciting answer, but you know what? That's the most valuable answer. That's the most ethical one. I'm going to give you another example. Two investors could look at the same cash flow positive property. One might be a business owner with strong income, good borrowing capacity, good long-term goal of building a portfolio that gives them even more income outside the business. The other might be a PAYG couple with young kids, tighter household budget, and limited borrowing room. The property could be the same, but the answer might be different. And that's why the strategy's got to come first. Might even be a good quality property that passes our Yield Club, right? And that's why your lending position's got to be understood. The household budget needs to be understood. The timeline needs to be understood. Your risk appetite needs to be understood. And most importantly, your long-term goals need to be understood. And then and only then should a property enter that conversation. That's why the Yield Club includes education market updates, not just opportunity, because the market is moving. Lenders are changing policy. We know that government's rules are changing. And most importantly, some investors don't have time every day to sit every single week tracking it. They've got work, they've got family, they've got business, they've got life. They've got a job that they're passionate about, right? Or not passionate about in some cases. And that's why part of the role of the Yield Club is to keep people better informed. That's why things like the weekly cash flow memo actually come in. And you're like, Gora, what is the weekly cash flow memo? Well, I'll explain in a moment. The goal is to help investors understand the changing in lending, rental demand, high yield strategies in the broader market without having to piece it all together from 5 different places. Now, let's bring all this back into SMSF property because that's very relevant right now. Now, inside Yield Club, we've had SMSs and SMSF friendly opportunities come through. I'm going to share with you a couple of examples. For example, a co-living property at 1.16 full turnkey with potential income of up to $80,000 per annum. That's right, 1.16 million, $80,000 per annum. We've also got a specialist disability accommodation property, not for everyone, at 1.225 that's already tenanted. Now, it doesn't have the $180,000 income per annum yet, but it's on track to. Now, I'm deliberately saying potential there because these are not guarantees. And anyone that's known me, I hate the word guarantees, right? I don't want anyone watching this to hear a number and go, oh, I'll just forget the process. The number's just the beginning of the conversation. The strategy, that's what determines whether it makes sense. Now, with an SMSF, we really need to ask, can the fund borrow? Can it move quickly enough? What's a deposit position right now? And does your risk profile make sense with the property we put in front of you? And with the 10th of August deadline approaching for SMSF borrowing, those questions become really important. And that's why the Yield Club becomes useful. Help takes the investor from, I'm interested but overwhelmed, to a more grounded conversation. What strategy are we using? What does the lending look like? What is the income we need? What strategy suits the goal? And what should we avoid? That last question is really important because you see, a good strategy doesn't just help you finding out what to buy. A good strategy helps you about avoiding the wrong fit. And you know what? In this market, avoiding a poor decision is just as valuable as finding a good one. So when people ask, how different is ethical property investment from a property sales agent? I'll rephrase that. Some people have actually asked, how different is ethical property investment from a sleazy property sales agent? Well, you know what? This is the answer. We don't want to start with the property. We want to start with the person because the same property can be brilliant from one investor and completely wrong for the other. And if we do our job properly, the investor should feel more informed before they ever make a decision. And that's what this is about. A better process, a more careful filter, a more serious look at cash flow positive investing, and a way to help people move from confusion into a proper strategy. So I want to bring this all together. Well, I've done a record live today, about 28 minutes. We've covered 3 important things. First, property rewards patience, and you don't build serious wealth by judging every single property after 6 months. Some markets move quickly, some sit flat, some need time. The job is to understand what you bought, why you bought, and whether it still fits the plan. But patience with the property doesn't mean ignoring deadline around finance. So anyone's looking at SMSF residential borrowing, 10th of August is your final date. So if you plan to use that bank lending in your SMSF via rental property, now is the right time to get that position started. In fact, it's too late if you haven't started already. And second, cash flow is becoming harder to ignore. A strategy that depends entirely on tax settings, future growth in your personal income, covering the gap, can be very uncomfortable when the conditions change. Now, cash flow positive property also gives us investors a different kind of support. It doesn't remove the risk and doesn't make every deal right. A strong income, it can help you hold, plan, and breathe when the market gets uncertain. And thirdly, at Yield Club, that exists because investors need strategy before property. People are tired of random deals. They're tired of being sold whatever happens to be available. They want to know what actually fits their lending, the goals, the budget, the timeline, and their risk position. That is why we built this, to filter high yield opportunities, to educate investors, and to share what we're seeing in the market, and to help people look at co-living, SCA, dual key, and even granny flat properties and SMSF properties with a proper process behind them. Now, if you're watching this, you're considering SMSF properties, especially before the budget deadline, and you're going, hey, Goro, those 2 properties seem interesting. Tell me more. Don't sit there guessing. Speak to your accountant, speak to your SMSF advisor, speak to your broker, speak to us if you want to know what kind of property strategies might suit you both in and out of SMSF. Now, we can help you look at the numbers, the strategy, the income goal, whether cash flow positive property actually makes sense for your situation. So if you're not ready for a full strategy conversation yet, that's cool. But you do want to stay close to the opportunities we're reviewing. And if you want to know more and see an example of what we've put into the Yield Club, there's a little teaser. We call it the cash flow memo. That's where we share useful updates around the high yield properties, rental shifts, rental demand, even this properties and beers every single week. It's an efficient way to stay informed about how we think about any big decision. Now, if you want to know more, drop me a line, say, Goro, I want access to the cash flow memo, right? So before we go, one more thing. A lot of people watching these live streams, they follow us on Facebook and Instagram. They haven't followed us on Facebook and Instagram, right? So make sure you follow Ethical Property Investments on Facebook and Insta. We're posting regular content every single day on how to make more informed decisions. And honestly, with how quickly lending, tax, SMSF rules, and property markets are moving, you don't want to be missing these updates. So stay close to the information, stay careful with your decisions, and remember, property can still be one of the most powerful ways to build wealth in Australia. But the strategy has got to fit the world we're investing right now. Thank you for joining me tonight for a record session. I'm Gaurav Gupta from Ethical Property Investments. Do good, make money, and always, I'll see you on Properties and Beers. Cheers, guys.